Shalom Aleichem, David. Good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon to you, Yoni. I'm here in the south of Israel, and nice to be speaking to St John's Wood. I'd hoped to be in London today, to be at the Tottenham Arsenal derby, but that's not on today.
Well, it's great to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon I'm interviewing David Newman OBE, who is originally British, but now Israeli academic and scholar in political geography. David is a professor at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev in the south of Israel, and an eminent world expert on geopolitics. And it's a real honor to have this chance to have a chat. First of all, David, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us what it's been like to have the privilege to live in Israel for the last 40 years. How are you doing? Tell us a bit.
I'm doing very well. And as you know, I spend a lot of time, particularly the last few years, commuting between Israel and England. When I'm in England, I stay in St John's Wood, which is why, although I'm not a total member of your community, it's where I come to daven and I meet people and I know a lot of the community. And I've been very impressed by this series of interviews you've been holding the last few weeks. Tomorrow's Independence Day, and I've been thinking about it. We've been living here nearly 40 years, 38 years. And as much as I like coming back and commuting to London every so often, I have to tell you, there's nothing like living in Israel. It's a fantastic experience. Both my wife and I are ex-Londoners, but we love living here with all of its problems, and not everything that we love here, but it's great being here. And you and members of the community are always welcome to visit us whenever you're in Israel.
Oh, thank you so much. We look forward. We look forward. David, tell me something. You're somewhat of an expert on Anglo-Jewish history as well. I know you had a particular interest in the amazing collection of windows we have at St John's Wood, the Hillman windows. We love it when you come to St John's Wood and you regularly lecture and speak in our synagogue. Perhaps share with us some information about the Hillman windows and your general knowledge of Anglo-Jewish history.
Well, I mean, I grew up very much in the Anglo-Jewish community. So did my wife. We both came from families whose family were rabbis and lay leaders in the United Synagogue in the Federation. I went part of my youth to a Jewish school, not the whole time. And so I have lots of connections with people in the Anglo-Jewish community. And during the last few years, when I've been back doing work and also with a lot of connections with King's College, I've been doing what you could call some hobby or therapy research. And I've been spending a lot of time sitting in the Anglo-Jewish archives, many of which are to be found at the London Metropolitan Archives in Farringdon. But I also have a very special interest in the David Hillman windows, of which are about 250 in London, but over 100 of them are in St John's Wood Shul. They are unique, they are beautiful, they are interesting, and as you and some of your others people know who daven in St John's Wood, when I get a bit tired by what a very long English Shabbat morning service is, I go and patrol the windows and spend every Shabbat looking at another one. One of the reasons I'm interested in them is because David Hillman was my great uncle. So it's part of a family thing. But it really is a unique heritage. And I can only tell members of the community who are listening to this, if you're not sufficiently aware of them, go have a look at them next time. Obviously not during the service and not during the sermon, but afterwards. But they really are unique and beautiful, and they're an architectural heritage.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, David. I think the Hillman windows are magnificent, and I urge everyone, when you next come to our congregation, please do take a look at them. I'm sharing with you now a few pictures of some of my favorites, and recently we had some special lighting done and the windows redone, so it's particularly wonderful on a summer's day to see through these windows, and I look forward to that moment very soon when we'll be back in the sanctuary to be able to enjoy these windows. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more briefly about David Hillman.
Well, David Hillman himself, his father was Dayan Shmuel Hillman, who was the head of the London-based inn from about 1910 to 1930, around that time. Originally from Lithuania, came to Glasgow, and then he came to be the head of the London-based inn. In the 1930s, he went to retire to Israel. David Hillman's sister was married to Chief Rabbi Herzog of Dublin, and then the first Chief Rabbi of Eretz Israel, of Israel. Yeah. And he himself was a member of St John's Wood Synagogue. He lived in Priory Road. I remember as a kid, we used to have to go for these terrible Sunday afternoon teas with our uncles and great uncles. And he used to take us up into his studio to see them. And the windows in St. John's Wood Shul, there are over 100 of them. The original 30 are actually from the old St. John's Wood Shul, the New London in Abbey Road. And when the new shul was built, they were brought over, and he was asked, this was 25 years later, to expand. So if you look at the windows, the outer 2 of every set of 5 were done 25 years later, and actually you can see the difference.
Wow, it's amazing. And a lot of them are dedicated as well to family members who were lost in World War I. And other sorts of things. And it's a remarkable thing, because now just chatting to you, it makes you appreciate it. I think when we go back to synagogue, we will certainly not take anything for granted, even the windows. David, tell us a little bit about what life's been like in Israel during the lockdown, and give us a little bit of an insight. I know your government's in the process of reforming, and there's been some exciting developments about the new government. Tell us a little bit about that as well, please.
Well, as you know, I mean, Israel undertook some very stringent rules right from day one, and many people thought they were exaggerated. We had a lockdown and a shutdown, isolation at home, not allowed out beyond 100 meters, everything closed down. And for free roaming Israelis, that was a bit of a tough thing. But I have to say that the data, without wanting to go into any sort of ridiculous, country one-upmanship, who's doing better or who's doing worse, different countries adopt different policies, obviously. But Baruch Hashem, thank God, although the infection rate isn't that low per 1,000 population, the actual deaths has only just about reached 200 altogether. And we're hoping now the government are beginning to open things up they're starting to allow now minyanim in the streets. And obviously in Israel, you have lots of areas where lots of religious people live close by. So in our community in Meitar, which is a mixed religious secular community, but we've had 2 or 3 over Shabbat, at the end of the road, people staying in their gardens and having a minyan together. It's been a bit tough. Obviously, I haven't seen my children or grandchildren for nearly a month, because people aren't allowed to travel long distances unless they have a real necessity to do so. But they're beginning to experiment with opening up, and but it's not over yet. It's not over yet anywhere, and we don't know when it's going to be over. There's a big challenge going to come this week with Yom Ha'atzmaut, and the government, I think, have decided they're going to crack down again on Yom Ha'atzmaut for 24 hours in order not to have a situation where tens of thousands of people go out onto the streets and mingle with each other.
Well, obviously this interview will actually be aired after Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron. It's one thing the government stopping people meeting for barbecues and social events and parties for Yom Ha'atzmaut, but it's another thing the government stopping grieving families visiting the graves of loved ones. That must be extremely challenging at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it is very challenging this year, because as you well know, tradition in Israel is that the 24 hours immediately prior to Yom Ha'atzmaut is Yom HaZikaron, when we remember all the fallen soldiers and people who have been killed by terrorists. And there's always been a long debate about whether that's an appropriate thing to have immediately before Yom Ha'atzmaut or not. Particularly, it's very hard for people who are close relatives of children or parents or siblings who have been killed in Israel's wars to immediately go into a day-long celebration. And if I'm not mistaken, Yoni, you yourself are named after a relative who was killed in the Yom Kippur War.
That's correct.
So it is very difficult altogether for people like that. And this year, again, for the fear of people catching the disease, they've been told there will be a ceremony from Har Herzl and from the Kotel, as there always is, but people will not be allowed to congregate at the military cemeteries on Yom HaZikaron. And this, of course, is causing, people understand it, but nevertheless, it's causing a great deal of grief. And there has been a little bit of criticism by some who say, how can you allow some of the shops to open if you're not going to allow the cemeteries to open? So it's a big dilemma. I'm sure everyone can understand the dilemma, and hopefully this will be the only time that this will ever happen.
David, as an expert of borders, it's an interesting time. First of all, so many borders have been closed, airports closed, international travel ban. People are not moving. And I'm sure there are some consequences in the post-corona world to how that may reflect in borders and government policy managing borders. Perhaps with your expertise, you could share with us some of your insights in that area.
Well, it is actually very interesting. I work with various governments around the world on their border issues. And obviously borders have changed in the last 30, 40 years. the way you negotiate borders, the way you move across them, the way that information moves across borders without you actually moving places. Borders aren't just the physical fences and walls at the edge of the state. At the same time, governments invest huge amounts of money and research and technology into protecting their borders, particularly in the last 10, 15 years from global terror. New walls have been built, new fences have been built, and so on. And what you find is, of course, however much you invest, there are things which pay no attention whatsoever to borders. I'll give you two very quick examples. One is the coronavirus. I mean, doesn't matter what wall or fence you have, you know, it goes beyond. And if you look at the other end of the scale, look at what Israel has been doing with the Gaza border, trying to prevent rockets and infiltration. And along come people with simple balloons, birthday balloons, and light an incendiary and put them on and just let them float into the air, and they cross any border. So it's a time where we're rethinking very much how we manage and control our borders throughout the world. And right now we're putting together some larger proposals for the next round of European, what they call Horizon 2020 research, because the EU are very interested in trying to understand this phenomena for the next 10, 20 years.
Fantastic. Sounds fascinating. You know, I'm sure our listeners are watching this, and they see you as a kind of role model exemplar of modern religious Zionism. You grew up in the UK, you're passionate Zionist, grew up in the B'nai Akiva movement. You did your PhD in geography, I think, in Durham University.
Durham,
you went off to Israel, you lived the dream, you raised a family in the land of Israel. And Zionism plays a big part of your life. And we all think about the peace in the Middle East and the prospect of peace, particularly with Trump's new peace deal. Has that been affected in any way by the coronavirus, by what's been going on? And what's your kind of hopes and projections for that?
Well, as you know, the name of the game, at least for the short term, is what they call the Trump deal of the century, where just before Corona broke out, Trump and Netanyahu announced this so-called amazing new peace deal. I'm slightly more skeptical and cynical about it. I've seen many peace deals be announced and then never get implemented. Meanwhile, of course, Corona came along and took over, and they had to put a new government together. And Trump made it very clear that, first of all, you have to get a government in place and you have to accept the whole of the deal. The deal has two parts to it: annexing settlements, which is problematic, as you know, and also an establishment of a Palestinian state on the rest of the territory. The Palestinians haven't yet signed on to it, and I have to say it's not surprising, because it's not really a deal that was negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians. This was a deal agreed upon between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I find it very hard to believe that the Palestinians would sign on to it, although I have to say that time has moved on. You know, we're now 50 plus years beyond the Six-Day War, and you can't create a peace agreement based on what happened, what was in 67. I'm not making any judgment about whether right or wrong, morality or immorality. There's a reality out there, a geopolitical reality out there, which is so different to what it was 50 years ago. And we need both sides to look at that reality and to move on from there. Whether the new government will succeed in pushing this forward, as I say, I'm slightly skeptical, but we live in hope.
Please God, we look forward to peace in our days very soon. I have one final question for you. You know, you're very accomplished with your OBE, which is amazing. I know you were hoping to meet the Queen at Windsor, but it was Princess Anne. But next time, perhaps when you get your knighthood, you'll go back to meet the Queen. Perhaps you could just share one final message to the community in St. John's Wood.
Well, when I first started coming back to London, it started 10 years ago for 2 years, and now the last few years, I was wondering, you know, where should I come and set up in London for, you know, a small apartment where I can come in and out of. My children are already grown up, and I didn't really need to be in the heart of Jewish London, although I wanted, obviously, a minyan, Jewish services, and St. John's Wood seemed to me to be a useful place to look at. I can walk, in theory at least, through Regent's Park to the British Library, to the universities, and it's a great location. I wasn't sure whether St. John's Wood was the right place. I wondered whether you know, it was a bit out of the way and there wouldn't be community activities, etc., etc. And I'm just taken back by the amount of activity that goes on there. for all ages, for all sorts of groups, pro-Israel groups, Jewish groups, study groups, children's groups. And a lot of that goes down to you and, of course, to my good friend Diane Binstock and his wife, who I think between you all, you have an amazing leadership there. And it really is an amazing community. And I'm very happy to be part of it when I'm in London.
Well, we look forward to welcoming you back soon. And I wish you and your family well. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Have a great day.
All the best, Yoni.